I will now proceed to introduce our presenter for today, Jason Kliwinski, who is affiliated with both New Jersey Institute of Technology and Rowan University in New Jersey. Many universities and colleges offer classes, minors, majors, and even masters in sustainability. Often these programs are housed under environmental science or other established academic science majors. When thinking about sustainability, we know the built environment has the single largest impact. It consumes over 70% of all electricity, emits 40% of all greenhouse gases, is responsible for 45% of all wastes going to landfills, and consumes 12 to 15% of all potable water. Students in a sustainability program need to understand this impact and the ways they can help reduce it in their own lives and work. The challenge in teaching this is that many of the programs in sustainability are not at places where there is a design or construction program, and often students as well as faculty have no or very little background in actual sustainable building design, construction, or operations. So during this webinar, Jason Kliwinski will seek to provide an overview of what makes a building green, resources to assist in developing and teaching content, discuss the triple bottom line of green buildings, and answer any questions or challenges you may have to the best of his ability. So the learning objectives stated by Jason: understand the impact of the built environment, define what makes a building green, discuss the triple bottom line of green buildings, identify available resources and tools for teaching about a green built environment. A bit about Jason's background: he is the founder and principal of his own architectural firm, Design for Life, serving commercial, retail, hospitality, higher education, and K through 12 clients with offices in Pennsylvania, central New Jersey, and Midtown Manhattan, serving the tri-state area. Jason focuses on three main areas: green architecture, consulting, and educational training. He's adjunct faculty, as I mentioned, at NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology, and Rowan University. In 2012, Jason was named a LEED Fellow by the U.S. Green Building Council, which is the highest professional accreditation through peer review of an applicant's work. Jason co-founded the Green Building Center in 2010 to focus on providing owners, developers, property managers, and real estate professionals a convenient one-stop location that brings green consulting, design, construction, products, alternate financing, and education together under one roof. And with that brief introduction, I invite Jason to pull up his slides. There you go. And before turning the floor over to Jason to begin his presentation, I again would like to welcome the attendees who have joined us since I started my introduction, and remind all to please mute your lines. And during the presentation, please type your questions and comments into the chat box, and I will tee them up for Jason as we proceed. So with that, Jason, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ira. I am sitting in my New York office today on the 22nd floor, yet every now and then you might feel like I'm sitting on the street. So I apologize in advance for some sirens or horns that you might hear in the background. You would think this high up it would be a little quieter. So thanks for that introduction. It's great to be here and to be able to talk to folks about the sustainable design aspect of education. And as Ira said, these are some of the learning objectives I had put together today after talking about what might be good for us to cover. The impact of the built environment, what makes a building green, the triple bottom line, and then I guess more importantly, what folks are probably really looking for are some resources and tools available to put course content together. And I'm going to give you some of the sources that I go to on a regular basis in addition from pulling from my own experience. My assumption is that many folks on the line here are actively teaching sustainability in their programs. They may already be familiar with many of these learning objectives in some way, shape, or form. I'm just going to share some sort of key points in courses that I try to make with students, and some of the differences and challenges between teaching architectural construction-based students and those who are not architectural and construction-based students, particularly when you're trying to talk about the built environment. So in terms of building impacts, these were some of the summary statistics in the presentation. The source for these has been the U.S. Green Building Council now for some time. I find that most students who are not architectural in nature really have no idea of the impact of the built environment. So when I talk about these, it's important to explain what these are and also sort of how that relates to things like climate change. So you see greenhouse gas emissions, you see electricity consumption, and the use between those two, the relationship is basically a 2-to-1 ratio. And in creating classes and coursework around these topics, one of these slides might actually be the intro slide for an entire day of content on courses. And picking up on the climate change factor, because really the big topic for me in sustainability as it relates to the built environment is mitigating the building's impact on climate change. And so this information you can find quite a bit of at the Architecture 2030 website, architecture2030.org. There are lots of studies and information there that show the predicted effects of climate change with strict rules, with some rules, and with business as usual. And in this particular slide, what it's showing you is that the Northeast is essentially going to have the climate of Georgia by around 2040 or so, based on current trends. This is a slide which is out of the presentation on climate change developed by Al Gore and the Climate Reality Project. There's about a 750 slide deck that comes with being a climate reality leader. That is something that I spent time, a few days with getting trained by Al Gore as a climate reality leader. I believe there's another training workshop coming up with him, and you can see that this time lapse shows you essentially carbon emissions and temperature change over from the Industrial Revolution and to present day. This happens to stop at 2011, but if I kept it running, it would just get redder and redder. This is, like I said, this is one slide in many from the Climate Reality Project presentation that I use in talking about the effects of climate change. Also in the Climate Reality presentation, the one nice thing about that organization is that they are always updating the presentation. About every 6 months, there is updates or new slide decks that come out from them, which as a climate reality leader, I have access to, and I can download and integrate that information into my presentations, which I have the right to use as a approved climate reality leader. This one happens to be talking about Hurricane Sandy, the sheer size and magnitude of it. There's slides in here that talk about the consequences of superstorms like this and what it leads to. And again, this slide comes from Architecture 2030. This one in particular talks about rising sea level. And what does that mean to planning? What does it mean to urban design? What does it mean to coastal cities? There's again a wealth of information at the Architecture 2030 website that I pull from. What this is showing you is that everything in blue and red is essentially going to be underwater in the next 10 to 20 years. There's not much that we think we can do to stop it. The stuff that is in shades of brown are potential next worst case scenarios if we curb some of our emissions but don't take more serious action. And then the stuff that's in green is business as usual. So that would be everything in blue, everything in red, everything in browns, and everything in green could potentially be underwater. And they have maps for the entire country, not just this part of the country. at the Architecture 2030 website. So depending on where you are around the world, you can go on to their website and find similar information. I happen to pull the East Coast because that's where I spend most of my time teaching. One of the other points to make when I'm talking to students, whether they're architectural or not, is this idea of cost. It always comes up when I talk about sustainable design, whether it's to a client or to students. Everybody, not everybody, but I would say a large majority of folks still seem to think that there is an added cost to build green. My architectural career has been based on not adding costs to build green buildings. So I'm probably one of the few architects walking around out there who has a portfolio of projects that didn't increase construction costs based on how it's done. But this idea of cost, a lot of people think about first cost or they think about operational cost. Assigning value to environmental costs has been hard up until some of these major storms. And you can see Katrina here was a $125 billion storm. Sandy, which is the one that I had just referenced, was a $70 billion storm. Now, I don't have information on Irma or some of the more recent storms yet, but I imagine that they're going to make this list in terms of costs. And this, again, comes from the Climate Reality Project website. This is another one of the slides that comes in their slide deck. But you see the source of this data is from insurance companies, Munich Reinsurance, Reuters, Swiss Re, that provided this information. In terms of defining what a green building is, I tend to ask my students for their architecture or non-architecture what they think this is. I always get different answers from everybody. Green buildings have to do a lot of things, and you can create individual courses on each one of these topics, which is what I tend to do in the more architectural classes that I'm teaching. But you can also do this in some way, shape, or form in the non-architectural classes as well. First one is talking about conserving natural resources. So anything having to do with water, land, raw materials, energy are all fair grounds for classes and topics. One whole class I teach is dedicated to water. Another whole class is dedicated to energy. Another whole class is dedicated to resources and resource conservation. There is enough content and material to make these individual classes or to make them parts of classes depending on what you're doing. Health and wellness. Honestly, in the green building world, today, health and wellness has become a primary focus, particularly with all of the pushback on climate change and the debate that our current administration has gotten us back into just when I thought that debate was over. We are spending a lot of time talking about sustainability from a health and wellness perspective today to try and take away, mitigate the confrontational nature that climate change seems to have suddenly. So daylighting, toxicity of finishes, ventilation, controllability. There's other things that aren't on here like ergonomics and acoustics, which would all be part of this conversation. Again, you can create individual classes on some of these topics, or you can group them and do classes around all of them. Operating costs, particularly in my world of architecture, I've got to meet a budget. So I've got a first cost I have to deal with. But then everyone is really interested in learning about operational savings. And that typically means electric, gas, water, and maintenance savings. The difference between talking about new buildings and talking about existing buildings is like night and day. So often it's difficult to do both in the same course or same class, but I do encourage you to try and do it. There are far more existing buildings than there will be new construction in the next 75 years. So I've spent a considerable amount of time in the courses that I'm developing and teaching to try and focus folks on what do we do with this existing building stock? How do we green that? And how can you convince owners to move on greening those existing buildings? And then last but not least, of course, is the reduction in impact on the environment. And that gets into greenhouse gases, sustainable harvesting of materials as part of the buildings or a campus's process. I find in this business, I've had a lot of success with individual buildings. That's sort of where my career in green building started. but it's expanded into campuses and cities and more master planning functions since then. And the idea of carbon neutrality master planning is something that has come up quite a bit lately. I've had the opportunity to do some of that work with a couple of universities in and around New Jersey. But this larger picture of how buildings, an individual building fits into a larger campus or a larger community is also a good basis for coursework. And one of the things I think is important to be teaching your students about is process. I have grown up in the design, bid, build process. That's how we deliver projects. Owner hires an architect, architect develops a schematic design with the owner. Eventually, we hire consultants to figure out how to heat it and cool it and make it stand up. We produce a set of construction documents without ever talking to a contractor. We invite contractors in to bid, and then we always seem surprised when the bids are too high. And we end up in this wonderful cycle known as value engineering, which is not really adding value, it's really taking stuff away because now nobody can afford what they wanted because there was not a line of communication between the design team and the contractor and the owner. So this process, this linear process, has been the conventional mode of delivery over and over again. Every public project I work on, every public university I work with, design, bid, build seems to be the ruling mechanism to deliver projects. So one of the things I think is important to talk to students about is that why is this the mechanism? The rules around design, bid, build were created in the early 1900s, and yet they still seem to be the governance of the land when it comes to procuring and delivering projects. As you can probably gather from my perspective on this, I don't think it's the best delivery mechanism to deliver a high performance, cost effective green building or campus or city. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So one of the things I like to talk about in class is this integrative approach, where we bring the owner, the design team, the contractor, the stakeholders, any other specialty consultants, the community together. We work in a roundtable format throughout the process: schematic design, design development, construction documents, and construction administration to deliver the project. And we are all involved in the programming and the construction documents and the construction and ultimately the operation of the building. This integrated approach, sometimes you'll see it done as integrative instead of integrated, being active tense versus past tense. To me is really critical. We need to change the process of delivering projects. And many times students in various fields, because we are a society of specialists, it lends itself to that linear approach. Your architect, your engineer, your contractor, and everybody thinks that they shouldn't necessarily be talking to each other at the same time. But I can tell you, nature is incredibly specialized, as you know, but yet it works as a system. Our project delivery mechanism doesn't follow the same suit today. We're starting to see some change in that, particularly with some larger public clients, like the New Jersey School Construction Authority, for example, or the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, where they're doing more design build integrated processes now because they've realized it's a better delivery mechanism. So this is an important topic to talk about. There is an entire book that was written about this called The Integrative Design Guide to Green Building by the 7 Group. It's a good resource. If you have not read it, it really outlines this process in great detail and makes a good textbook. And when I talk about an integrated team, this team can be very large and cover a wide swath of different sectors of the market. And as you can hear in the background, we have some sirens going by, so I apologize. It includes ownership, it includes the construction teams, it includes the design team, it includes specialty consultants. My guess is that probably whatever type of student you're teaching, they fit one of these categories. And whether they realize it or not, they are a critical part of this integrative process. So in terms of the triple bottom line, I'm guessing that this is not new to many of you. When we talk about the triple bottom line in buildings, we are talking about the economics, the environment, and the equity, social equity, people, planet, profits, whichever of those sticks in your head best, the 3 Ps or the 3 Es, I like to call them. But the thing I talk about this a little differently is in terms of being able to use this as a conversation piece with a potential client. How do you convince a client to do a project and make it more sustainable? If your client is interested in economics and you're talking about the environment, you're going to lose them. Likewise, if your client is interested in people and they're really focused on health and wellness and you're just talking about budget, you're probably going to lose them. So one of the things I try and teach students about the triple bottom line is not just what it is, but how to use it as a conversation piece, how to understand the person that is sitting across from you and talk about sustainability from the thing that matters the most to them. Because if someone can learn to do that, then they can make a very successful career for themselves. Of course, on the cost side, cost is usually one of the first things that come up, but what most people don't realize is people are in fact the most expensive thing in buildings. And I find that when I ask the question, what's the most expensive thing in a building, almost nobody says people. And if you ask any CEO who runs a business, I don't care whether it's a university or a K-12 school or a Fortune 500 company or a mom and pop shop, they will all tell you that their largest line item expense to run their business is their staff, their salaries, their sick days, their benefits. So one of the things I think is important to talk to students about is this notion of cost and shifting the perspective and the conversation away from first cost and operating costs to, again, this impact on health and wellness. And what does that impact on health and wellness mean to performance and productivity of staff and therefore the bottom line of a company or business or university? How much time that we spend in buildings? This goes hand in hand with the whole health and wellness concept. We spend most of our time in buildings. And again, usually when I ask this question, nobody has really thought about it. But if you're in a building 90% of your time, your exposure to potential toxic products, bad ventilation, poor daylighting, all those things is increased. So it's important for students to understand the exposure that we have to buildings and therefore the higher impact on health and wellness that can bring. This is a study which you can go find online. I didn't put the name on the slide here, so I apologize. The name of the study is called the Heshan-Mahon study. And it was done on daylighting and ventilation, primarily in a wide range of buildings. These happen to be the results from daylighting. The one that usually catches my academic folks' eyes is the 20% better on math and language tests in terms of performance. The one that catches my corporate friends' eyes is the 2 to 16% increase in productivity from staff. And then there's healthcare is addressed here with earlier discharge from hospitals, retail, commercial, with higher sales per square foot. All of that's from daylighting. So, again, when we talk about cost and impact, what's the value of a building that is delivering better test scores from students? What's the value of a workspace that is increasing the productivity 2 to 16% of those workers, knowing that people are the biggest cost in your building and in your company? So it's important to make these points to students, whether they're design students or non-design students, to understand the building's impact on human health and wellness. And of course, the infamous question I'm always asked in my career, does it cost more to build a green building? Well, my answer to you is no. These are some economics on LEED projects, which are from up until about 2005. So LEED began in 2000. And there's now 16 years of history with it. And there was a premium for certification of LEED buildings up until around 2005. And today, what we've seen in the industry is that premium has all but gone away. A LEED gold building, you might see some costs for, depending on what you do. A LEED platinum building, because of the level of performance, you will definitely see some increase in cost. But certified silver and gold can potentially be achieved at no additional cost. So that's first cost. Now, if I can achieve a sustainable design project at no additional cost, and I know I can save you anywhere from 10 to 50% of your operational cost, which is what you're seeing in this chart as the dark purple, why wouldn't you want that building? One of the conversations that I want to get my students into is not why should someone build green. That's the wrong perspective. I want my students to be in a conversation where the owner is saying, well, why wouldn't I do that? Why would I want something else? Being able to talk about little or no first cost, impact on human health and wellness, and therefore productivity, and large savings and operational costs make this really a no-brainer conversation to build green. And this has largely been the foundation of my approach in the last 15 years of my architectural practice. And now I've been teaching this sort of content for the last 8 years as well. It's important for students to understand where energy is used in buildings. Many students don't, whether they're architectural or engineering or non-architectural. If climate change is one of our biggest problems today and buildings are primarily responsible for it, and that is driven by electric consumption in those buildings of power purchased off the grid, well, logic would say if I know where I'm using the most energy in buildings, I can start to really tackle that problem, whether it's a new building or an existing building. So here you see that heating and cooling are the top two, heating being slightly higher than cooling. Lighting and plug loads are the next two, and they often battle for third place. But between heating, cooling, and lighting, there's about 70% of all the energy consumption in the building. And so to tackle those things, now we can start to have a conversation, whether it's an existing building or whether it's a new building, of what affects them and what can we do to reduce that impact the most. I talk about average savings that are possible with green buildings. This is something that owners want to know. It's something that students should be able to talk about and talk about it intelligently. Energy, water, carbon, waste, all things are possible here. These are averages. This can obviously be higher or lower depending on what you're doing in the project. And then knowing the benefits. Students should be able to rattle off the benefits of green building without blinking an eye. And there are many. The first one that everybody wants to hear, there's no additional cost to build green. If you tell them there's an additional cost, well, that doesn't mean the conversation is over, but it certainly makes it a harder conversation. Improved occupant performance. People, owners in particular, are really, really focusing on occupant health and performance these days. So being able to talk about that impact, that positive impact, is really key. The reduced environmental impacts, I have some clients who care about this, and I have some clients who really don't. They're looking at first cost, they're looking at productivity. Yeah, they want to do the right thing, but that's not the major decision maker for the project. Students still need to understand that. If they're focusing on health and wellness or they're focusing on cost reduction, they are simultaneously reducing the impact on the environment. They may not be able to talk about it as much with a particular owner because of their interests, but it's something that they need to be able to understand and communicate. If there is a premium, there should be a payback. And understanding the reduction in operating costs is going to help someone make an argument about the return on investment. And that return on investment is often going to decide whether or not a project proceeds at the end of the day. Related to occupant performance is better indoor air quality, durability, and last but not least, one of the things that I think has been left out in large part in this is using the building as a teaching tool. I've developed curriculum for K through 8, for high school, and for university programs based on the sustainable features of their buildings. You can create content and classes around energy projects, around solar projects, around renovations using sustainable materials. There is almost always a story to be told about a project or a building that can be used as a lesson plan, a living lab, an educational piece. And the built environment is a wonderful learning tool. Sometimes it teaches you what not to do. Sometimes it teaches you what to do. But in all cases, it's a learning opportunity. Measuring green is always something that is challenging. There are a lot of different metrics out there. The one that I live by is the building codes and standards that we have to follow, but building codes and standards don't ensure sustainability or performance. If you're not in the design and construction community, you're probably not familiar with what the codes and standards are that we follow. The international building codes developed by the International Code Council govern design and construction in most states. When it comes to energy performance, ASHRAE is the governing code of most states as well. You also have the International Energy Conservation Code, which is based on ASHRAE. So different states use different codes, but at the end of the day, these codes and standards are a minimum. As I tell my students and my clients, they are the worst building that I can give you not to go to jail. So I never recommend designing a building just to code. And I don't know too many clients who want the bare minimum building. They want more for their money. Buildings are expensive to build. They're expensive to operate and maintain. They're probably one of the most expensive things someone is going to invest in their life ever. So just giving them a bare minimum code compliant building to me is not acceptable. And certainly if we're talking about sustainability, it requires a higher level of care. It requires a higher bar. So we have to have a bar to measure. There are a number of third-party rating systems out there that I talk about in my classes. All of these organizations have a wealth of information on their websites that you can pull from and create content and curriculum around. Energy Star and the Health House and Passive House are three different certifications that really focus on one thing. Energy Star and Passive House focus on energy. The Health House focuses on indoor air quality. The others up here, Living Building Challenge, Green Globes, NAHB, and LEED, they are very holistic third-party certification systems. Energy is a piece of all of them, but it is one piece of about 6 or 7 different things that these systems look at. The newest rating system that has popped up is WELL, the WELL building system. And it is a spin-off of LEED. It has some overlap with LEED, but its focus is on sustainability from a health and wellness perspective of the occupants. This is really taking the green building world by storm right now. And there has been a lot of focus and a lot of talk on the WELL building standard because of the recognition of the impact of buildings on productivity and health and wellness of people. A lot of what I organize my class around, my various classes, is LEED. I am a LEED faculty. I am a LEED fellow. I've been designing and certifying LEED buildings for 15 years. It is the rating system that I know the most about. I also incorporate the Living Building Challenge and the new WELL building standard quite frequently because they veer off into slightly different things than LEED does by itself. And LEED uses Energy Star as its baseline. So by incorporating LEED, I'm already talking about Energy Star. And for those of you that don't know, LEED is broken up into categories: location, site, water, energy, materials, indoor environmental quality. Quite frankly, each one of these is a potential lesson plan. You could run 6 classes or even 12 classes around these topics from the LEED rating system. The U.S. Green Building Council, who owns and maintains and updates the LEED rating system, they have a site that is called Tools for Schools, where they do provide some content. They also have developed something called a LEED Lab, which is focused on providing content at higher education universities. The catch there is you have to be willing to certify an existing building through LEED-EB. And if you are, they will help you create an entire course around LEED for existing buildings and how that process works to green existing buildings. And what a lot of folks don't realize about the LEED rating system is how the point structure is set up. And so you can see in this chart that the things that affect climate change the most in LEED get the most points. The things that affect human health get the second most points. The things that affect water efficiency get the third most points. So the LEED rating system actually lends itself very well to talking about sustainability in design and construction because of how it's weighted its point structure. What affects buildings the most? when I start to get into this and talk about impacts, I've already told you that HVAC and lighting account for about 70% of the building's energy use. But what I haven't told you is what affects those. Well, the first thing is orientation. That is typically the responsibility of the architect or civil engineer. The integration of renewable energy systems into the building to offset some of that consumption. The use of natural systems like daylighting and natural ventilation, which are the responsibility of the architect to integrate into the design. A better building envelope than just a code compliant building envelope, which affects the loads on the heating and cooling system. The types of equipment that we select in terms of their efficiencies. And then what kind of products and materials are we putting in the building that may affect its operation? And ultimately, do we have good daylighting? Do we have good ventilation? Are we going to improve the health and wellness of people or not? And these things all interact. One of the hardest things to teach students, particularly non-architectural students, is that buildings are systems. They're not individual components. All of these systems rely on one another and are affected by one another. So when I'm teaching this to students, it's really critical to point out these synergies and spend time doing lessons and exercises that help them understand the impact and a relationship of one component on another component within the larger system of a building. And then I usually show them case studies. Now, as a practicing architect, I have my own case studies. So this is a net zero energy house in New Jersey. This is a LEED Gold certified bank, which turned into a net zero energy bank in the next project. This is a net zero energy ready school in Philadelphia that has many sustainable features in it. LEED Gold certified. It includes rainwater catchment, a green roof, extensive daylighting, integrated solar in the glass. So there's a lot of things to talk about on this project to demonstrate concepts. This is a preservation project. You know, one of the key aspects of sustainability is preserving and restoring stock. The thing that I hear consistently from students, whether it's college students or whether it's professional adults taking classes, the case studies are the most important thing to them. I hear it over and over and over again because it helps make the concepts reality. Particularly for those who aren't doing this every day, it seems that the case studies are even more important. So whether you have your own case studies or whether you go find case studies, what I have learned is that carefully selecting case studies so that you can use them to demonstrate the points you're making will help your students tenfold in actually retaining and understanding content. So we have 100 level courses that I teach, and to me, these are the sort of basic knowledge, what is it and why care. These tend to be shorter, although I've taught longer courses at the 100 level. The class exercises are important to engage students. And again, the case studies for comprehension and retention seem to be really key. And these can be done in person, they can be done live webinar, they can be done entirely on demand. A lot of these 100 level courses now, I've recorded and they're out there on the web for people to take rather than doing them as a live class, but I still do all three of these. 300 level course to me is more about understanding. They have a base knowledge. Now the question is, what do they do with that knowledge? These tend to be longer courses. This could be a week-long intensive. It could be a half a semester. It could be an entire semester, 1 to 15 weeks. Usually because of the time, we have the ability to assign independent research and then have that brought back to the class. I'll often give a class project and have students working on different aspects of a topic and then all report back individually so that we can learn from one another and they become part of the process of teaching. It's not just me talking for the entire class. We use in-class videos, homework. We do quizzes and testing to reinforce and sort of confirm that they're getting it as part of the uptake for the content. And again, the case studies consistently are the greatest assistance in comprehension and retention of material, it seems. And then the 500 level courses, this is really application and evaluation. How do you use it? How do you use the knowledge and improve it? What's the next thing? What's the next greatest? What's the next cutting edge? I'm on the PhD committee for a couple of students who are doing their PhD in sustainability, and there's not really much ground for that. So trying to figure out, where do we go from LEED? You know, where do we go from Living Building Challenge? How do we create carbon neutral cities? These are sorts of the, net zero energy, net zero water, net zero waste. These are the sort of cutting edge topics that are out there and in demand in the marketplace right now. These could be anything from short intensive classes to longer courses. Typically independent research and presentations are part of these. And here I'm trying to get students to do group projects more than in other classes, because this is really about applied knowledge at this level. I'm not teaching about the lead rating system. I'm expecting them to take the lead rating system and do something else with it. And then in terms of assessing, homework, testing, and reading are all parts of the assessment process. But again, the case studies, and if you can get out to actual sites to visit, seem to be the best feedback from students in terms of comprehension and retention at this level as well. So I wanted to show you some sample courses here just to wrap up my piece, and then we'll take some questions. So I'm teaching a class called The Principles of Sustainability. It's a 100 level class at Rowan. It is a full semester. Week 1 is the overview. Week 2, we start talking about ecological systems and life cycle thinking. And this, by the way, is a non-architectural class. I have students in this class who are just out of high school. I have students who have been in college for a while and are changing their majors. And I have adult learners in this class who have been out in the field for 15 or 20 years who are coming back to either tune up their skills or to change their careers. So I've got a wide audience sitting in this class, and this class covers a lot of ground. This is probably one of the more comprehensive sustainability courses I've ever worked in. So again, week 2, ecosystems and life cycle thinking. Week 3, we start talking about natural capital and threats to ecosystems and ethics around the management of resources. We get into carrying capacity and human population as that affects sustainability. We talk about food and agriculture in great detail, water and water supplies, and how to manage those natural resources. We do get into climate change and fossil fuels and also the politics of climate change. We might as well tackle that subject head on because it's out there and everyone's got to deal with it every day. We introduce sustainable energy, and we get into the energy efficiency and alternative energy technologies. At this point, by week 7 or 8, we've had a midterm. We've probably had 3 or 4 quizzes. We've had 1 or 2 homework assignments to assess knowledge along the way, and there's reading every week as part of this. Week 10, we're talking about transportation and planning. Week 11, we're talking about waste and consumption patterns. Week 12, we actually talk about buildings. Notice I didn't get into talking about buildings until the 12th week of this class. This class is not focused on the built environment alone. It's focused on all of the systems on this planet that support us. We get into environmental justice, and then lastly, green jobs. Like I said, many people are just starting their career, changing majors, or looking to retool themselves. So the assistance in actually translating the curriculum into a job seems to be something that folks appreciate. And then we have our final. So our assessment during the class, we have a green jobs report where they do research on a particular field or job that they're interested in and present it to the class. We have a report on a sustainable solution to one of the problems that we've talked about, whether it's pollution or water use or farming, and what the sustainable solution is they recommend and why. We have 4 short, what we call critical thinking and reasoning reports. They're essays on different parts of the reading assignments. We have our traditional quiz, midterm, and final. And then throughout the course, I throw in extra credit assignments randomly for folks to keep them on their toes if they're interested. Some of the resources I use, storyofstuff.org has some great 15 to 20-minute videos. YouTube has a wealth of videos on sustainability and various topics. You just have to take the time to cull through them. And then Netflix has some great documentaries. And so I use a combination of this media in class and also after hours for students. This is a course that is about to go live in January. This is sustainability design. It's geared at 300 and 500 level. It is going to be a completely online 8-week class. I can tell you I've never done a completely online class before, so developing this content is new to me. Week 1 is our intro. Week 2 is integrative project delivery, and then you'll see this looks a lot like the lead rating system. Location, site, water, energy, materials, and indoor environmental quality. So we're spending time on each of these topics. This is focused on design, which is why it's focused on these topics. Similar assessment, quiz, case studies, completion of some calculators which are within the LEED rating system, and then using similar video resources, Story of Stuff, YouTube, and Netflix. So some resources, again, that I use on a regular basis: the Architecture 2030 website, the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. This is where any university that is going for carbon neutrality has their information. There's also great resources there. The Clean Air Cool Planet Calculator is what most universities use to calculate their carbon footprint and come up with plans from. And then you've got ASHE, the U.S. Green Building Council. The AIA, the American Institute of Architects, has their own 2030 commitment, which is based on the Architecture 2030 commitment. That is for firms in particular. The Climate Reality Project, as I mentioned, if you're interested in becoming a climate reality leader and having access to those slide decks, the training is free. You just have to apply. And then my own organization, the Green Building Center, we have a wealth of education and content that we've developed as subject matter experts practicing in the field on a regular basis. And with that, Ira, I believe we'll open it to questions.
Very good. Thanks so much, Jason. I can tell you I learned a lot in this presentation. I'm sure those in the audience did as well. A number of questions of different types have come in. Since you just ended up on resources, during your presentation, you mentioned a study where the second of the two names was Mahone. Do you have would you like to repeat the name of that study, or?
Yeah, it's the Heshon-Mahon study. It's Heshong. That's Heshon. And then Mahone, Mahone, Heshon-Mahon.
Very good.
If you type that into Google and search for it, you'll be able to find it. The original study is a couple of 100 pages, and there's a couple of abbreviated excerpts from that study that focus just on the daylighting or ventilation as well.
Thank you. The next question that came in as you were presenting was asking for elaboration of the building itself as a teaching tool. I think you did come back to that and emphasized buildings as a system, which I think was a critical point in your presentation. Is there anything else that you would like to elaborate on the building itself as a teaching tool?
Well, one of the hard things to do is to create curriculum around technologies and strategies. So there are some lesson plans that have been developed, which started in the K through 8 and the 9th through 12th grades for me on LEED projects, where we wrote curriculum working with the teachers in the format that they needed to have it in order to meet the Department of Education standards. And that has grown into creating content for universities and other clients to use the building as a teaching tool with their students, their staff, and even their visitors. So you can create content around any green feature of a building, whether it's daylighting or solar or an energy efficiency project or waterless urinals or any of those sorts of things. Any of those aspects in a building can become the piece around which you create a lesson plan. That's experiential learning to integrate the building into the process.
Very good. There were a number of questions and comments about the section of your presentation that related to codes and standards. And I would just observe that the point that you made about building to code equals building to the minimum was an important takeaway, and I certainly appreciated that as an attorney. There were other comments that came in, most of them specific to LEED. And since you've referenced LEED, presumably you are a LEED user and a fan of LEED, but a couple of commenters mentioned that they have heard criticisms of LEED, and were asking for your comment on either the credibility or limitations of LEED as an evaluation of the sustainability of a building.
Well, it is something that comes up quite a bit. There's a couple of things I can tell you about the rating system. First and foremost, it's not perfect. It is something that has evolved over the last decade, and some say it doesn't go far enough. And in some respects, they're probably right. But the one thing that's different about LEED versus other systems is it's a consensus document. It's a rating system that's developed by the construction industry, the design community, the government community, and the end user together. It's not a system that is dictated by a private body in a small room. So does it go far enough? No. Does it go enough to transform the marketplace and move us to the next level of sustainability? Yes. And can you blame LEED when a building doesn't perform? No. It is a goal. And if the goal that you've established as part of your certification is to be net zero energy, well, then that's a lofty goal. But you don't have to be a net zero energy building to get a LEED certification. And I think part of the confusion in the marketplace is that people assume if it has a LEED label that it's an energy efficient building. And that's just not necessarily true. It never has been true. But I think that's been some of the misunderstanding of the rating system. The rating system's holistic. That net zero house that I showed you briefly is only LEED silver. And it's only LEED silver because it's in the middle of nowhere and has no access to transportation. So the thing that I tell folks about LEED certification is you have to look at what they actually did. You have to look at the report card and see what they goals were in getting their certification, because frankly, one LEED silver building is not like another. You cannot assume that they all are at the same level of performance. That is a misconception in the marketplace about what the LEED label means.
Excellent clarification. Really appreciated that. There were actually other questions and comments about LEED, so let me just float a couple of others for you. One person seemed to be aware that in addition to the list of different types of LEED standards that was on your slide, that there was a LEED standard not just for buildings, but also for communities. And another attendee indicated that, referencing your Architecture 2030, is that there is an initiative out there called 2030 districts that look at the entire downtown areas and subject them to assessments, and asking you to comment.
Yeah, LEED came out with a version of its rating system called neighborhood development. That predates the Architecture 2030 eco districts that they've come up with, but it's sort of built on that. So you've got the LEED for neighborhood development, which is certifying entire development zones, not just individual buildings. It's really focusing on the infrastructure and planning and integration within the community. You've got the Architecture 2030 assessment, again, which is focused on more of creating carbon neutral districts and areas. There's something called eco districts, which is another certification out there that focuses, again, more of a community regional scale than in individual building. So you're seeing this happen a lot. What was just focused on individual buildings has expanded into planning, neighborhood planning, community development, entire regions as part of the process. It's a natural evolution to me. LEED just came out with something brand new that's not even published called LEED for Cities, which is a spin-off of the LEED for Neighborhood Development certification, and they're just piloting LEED for Cities right now. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in the planning and larger scale regional thinking, as well as just individual buildings. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. You referenced on one of your slides Energy Star, and I believe you mentioned that Energy Star is incorporated into at least one of the lead standards in some way. And one attendee wrote in to say, I thought Energy Star got killed off by the Trump administration. And yes, I can comment briefly on that. And Jason, if you have more up-to-date information, my understanding was that Energy Star is proposed for the chopping block under the administration's budget, but had not been killed off just yet. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yeah, there's been talk about it, but it still is there and still exists and still being used. And I have to think that if it is defunded by the Trump administration, that it will be funded by someone else.
Great point.
There's just too much information and data for that to disappear. I would like to believe that that is not going to happen.
Yeah, I would second that notion that someone would pick it up. I guess was also a very welcome component of your presentation was walking through the components of your 100 level sustainability principles course and your 300 to 500 level sustainable design course. We didn't get any questions specific to the more general principles course, but I would take this opportunity to note that for the audience that Jason was involved in a panel at our SCC faculty conference in Philadelphia earlier this year that sought to distinguish between the 100, 300, and 500 levels of sustainability courses in terms of content. And it also causes me to mention to those on the line and listening to the recording that will be posted soon on our website that the follow-on from the session in which Jason participated has evolved next into an online curriculum dialogue, which will continue this discussion about the 100, 300, 500 level, basically sorting content geared toward teaching faculty. And Jason, you and I should follow up on that as well. Also, Jason mentioned some very useful resources. Again, the slides that Jason presented will be incorporated into the video recording that we will have posted. So I will pass on asking Jason to repeat those resources, other than to note that this webinar will become a resource available to those accessing the SCC website, along with all of the other video recordings of our webinars, which all of you can utilize as resources for your courses. Jason, I'm going to give you the last word after I quote one of our regular participants, Gary Bowen, in the chat box is thanking you for a very thorough presentation in the time allotted. I agree with that. Extremely helpful and much appreciated. Jason, your final thoughts.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad this was helpful for folks to hear, and hopefully some of the resources can be useful in planning and designing and tweaking courses that you may have or be planning to put out there. For me, moving into the online education world is something that is newer, but where things seem to be going. So now I'm looking at ways to take in-person courses where you have interaction and different kinds of relationships with the audience, and how do you get the same results? How do you take sustainability and translate that in-person experience to an online class. So that's sort of what I'm looking at next and best practices for that.
Very good. Yes, online approach is very important, and SCC is experimenting with online approaches through our cohort programs. And again, Jason, you and I should also explore that further. With that, I will thank you again for doing a great webinar, and all this follows up on your participation in the SCC Faculty Conference. As I mentioned early in my introduction, we are already planning the 2018 SCC Faculty Conference, and those of you who have an interest in presenting or otherwise participating in the faculty conference, or have ideas on topics that ought to be included in our webinar series or our cohorts or in the next faculty conference, by all means log on to curriculumforsustainability.org and send me an email, and let's pursue that discussion. Jason, thanks again. I'm going to end the recording here, and that is all for today. Signing off.
Great. Thanks, Ira.
Bye-bye.